Wow, guys, I watched such a superb interview last night with my wife. I just had to bring it to you. And it's Eddie Hobbs with Dr. Vincent Carroll and absolute revelations about the Cass report from UK, published not too long ago, and what it said about the science on managing transgender, etc. issues. And it's an absolute bombshell. It's been adopted in the UK now. Ireland and other places in the world are refusing to acknowledge it, and they're sticking with the NGOs and the lobbyists. And they are actually damaging our children, which is a pretty big deal. But stay up to speed, get the latest science, watch this interview now with Dr. Carroll, and truly, it's a revelation.
What's your reaction to what's going on over in the United States?
Well, I'm delighted with what's going on. I mean, it seems a bit of common sense is getting into the whole sort of American political scene. The question is trying to import it across the Atlantic into the Irish political scene. It's a completely different sort of situation, obviously. But I haven't read the full executive orders, but I've been briefed on them, and an awful lot of them would be, I suppose, supportive of what we're here to talk about today, which of course is the Dr. Hilary Cass report from the UK.
Now, can I just pause you there, because I know you've described it, you've described the Cass report, which I'll just mention briefly to those that are plugging into this for the first time, because a lot of this is new to me as well, Vincent, so that helps viewers to understand it. So the Cass report was set up in 2020 by the NHS, commissioned by the NHS, and it is led by Hilary Cass, who's a consultant paediatrician, former president of the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health, and with quite a lot of experience in the whole area of gender dysphoria and the whole transgender area. So this is call this the gold standard. Can you just explain why you've said that?
Yes, it is gold standard as medical best practice. I mean, the Cass report is very, very rigorously thought out, rigorously investigated. There have been many stakeholders putting in their scientific input into the Cass report. It's been 4 years in creation. Dr. Hilary Cass herself is an enormously eminent paediatrician. She was former president, as you said, of the Royal College of Paediatrics. It's a report that's beyond it is the gold standard, and it represents medical best practice, and therefore it cannot be ignored by agendaists or by lobby groups or anything like that. It's simply a medical report like any other medical report, and it shouldn't be controversial in any way. It moves the science on to where we are now, and the now is post-Cass. That's where we are.
There was a number of things in the Cass report I wanted to just touch on with you, just to get your reaction to it. The Cass report seems to me to suggest that the whole methodology behind all of this, which goes back to from this organization, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which was set up in 1979 and was originally the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. I just want to focus on the word dysphoria first. Dysphoria is the complete opposite of euphoria. It's a Greek term, isn't it? So,
that's correct.
So when you're in a state of dysphoria, what does that mean clinically, Vincent?
Well, I mean, clinically, I suppose it brings in the concept of imaginary conditions, you know, okay. And that's what's very important, because many people consider that the whole transgender, I suppose, drift where we're going is an imaginary condition. The concept of people finding themselves born in the wrong bodies, and that is a form, in that sense, that is dysphoria. But the Cass report itself, I mean, is gold standard because of the vast number of scientific, peer-reviewed inputs into that report. It cannot be challenged, and that's very, very important. And as you say, it was commissioned by the NHS, but on behalf of the UK government, and has been accepted by the UK government.
It's been widely accepted, Vincent, isn't it? I mean,
it's widely accepted by, the important thing is it's accepted by the UK government, by the Labour government. It's accepted by the Conservative opposition, under whose watch it was commissioned, but it's also accepted by the academic and professional bodies such as the Royal College of General Practitioners, which is the overseeing ethical and a scientific body for all GPs in the United Kingdom, and also by the College of Paediatrics, as you would expect, but also by the general body that oversees all medical education as well within the UK. So it's widely accepted, and it should not be controversial. But it is controversial, of course, because of the topic that is covered because of lobbyists who would have different views.
Yeah, it seems to be a fly in the ointment because, like, if you look, as I understand it, stop me know if I get any of this wrong, Vincent, right? But as I understand it, the Irish approach is very much driven by this WPATH model, which is adopted throughout the world. And lots of activists who support all that seem to see the CAS report as a fly in the ointment, because one of the things that jumped out, there's a number of things I want to ask you about, but one thing that really leapt out of the report as I went through it over the weekend is that, just last weekend, was that they're really getting at it. Like, they're saying in the most polite English way, this is science. We need to replace ideology with science. That what we've been doing here is creating an affirmation impulse behind any child that might have gender dysphoria, gender confusion, feeling listless, feeling they're in the wrong body and all the rest of it. And they're saying, no, we need to replace that. Stop me if I'm getting this wrong, with a holistic approach, multidisciplinary teams, where there's a focus on child safety and an understanding, a better understanding that an awful lot of what we've been doing now is not supported by any evidence. They call it, the evidence is weak, which means to me there isn't any evidence. I'm sorry, I might be wrong.
Correct. That's correct. And you mentioned the WPAT, WAPAT, the World Transgender, whatever. I mean, that sort of was set up, as you say, about 20 years ago or a bit longer.
1979.
The interesting thing about that is it is not gold standard, because the running of it boils down to some academics, but is heavily weighed in favor of people who have no scientific background, but who have a background in lobbying and who have a background on agenda. So the WPAT is a mixture, therefore, of agendaists and some doctors and some people involved in this area of work. So it is something that you cannot have any confidence in. But it was the only show in town, if you like, until the CAS report came out in April.
Which was a 4-year report. Yeah.
Absolutely. But the important thing, and this is very important and is very poorly understood, is that when our programme for government was put together in 2020, in the small print of that programme for government, inserted, my understanding is, at the behest of the Green Party, there was an adherence, a commitment in the programme of government to stick to the WPAT, the WAPAT, the thing that we were talking about, guidelines. Now, that's an extraordinary thing to put into a programme of government, because in fact, it's almost like saying in a programme of government, you'll prescribe these antibiotics, but not those antibiotics. It doesn't allow for science to move on. It doesn't allow for scientific change to occur. And to have that nailed down in a programme of government, absolutely hamstrung all the professional associations of this country. And I suspect the Irish College of General Practice, the medical colleges, so on and so forth. I mean, they knew that if they would support the CAS report, that they were going directly against the programme for government. So I suppose weak people on occasion are very, very prone, therefore, to row in rather than do what the rest of the world is doing, particularly in the United Kingdom, endorsing and embracing the CAS report. And I'm calling for the CAS report in this country to be unequivocally endorsed and embraced by all the academic medical bodies and everybody else for that matter, because it's not just something aimed at the medical profession, at doctors and at patients coming in. It could be applied to schools, to sports clubs, to cultural associations, to youth clubs, to absolutely anything. All I'm asking for is the CAS report as gold standard, best practice, scientific report to be embraced and adopted as gold standard.
No. What was refreshing about the reading of it was the speed at which the British themselves responded to the science and ditched beta blockers and basically stopped their current gender identity services model completely and are now replacing it with 8 centres with multidisciplinary teams. They're following the pathway set by the CAS report in substantial detail. Whereas over here, we're still following this thing from 1979 that's ideologically based. And what resonates here for me, I don't know if you're aware, you probably know this stuff, Vincent, but back in I think it was 1960 or 61, the Germans came out with a study out of the blue. Dr. Lenz, I think his name was, basically saying, look, thalidomide is causing deformation in babies, and we're pulling it from the market very quickly. The Germans pulled it, and within about 5 or 6 days, the British following the science. We didn't pull it for 4 years. And it took us 10 years later before RT did a documentary on it. So we have a horrible record in following science in this country when
There's
it
something
when it,
very
when it
wrong there,
interferes
but
with
this
vested
time round it's
interests.
agenda driven, and it's the agendaists that seem to be controlling the narrative. And you know, you can't vote science in or vote science out. Science is science, and the way you challenge science is with other peer-reviewed articles. And there's nothing peer-reviewed which will challenge the Cass report, nor is there likely to be anything peer-reviewed into the next decade which will challenge the Cass report. Too much work has gone into it. It's gold standard. The science, that is the science, and we should simply embrace it.
Well, as a lay person going through it, that really jumped out at me as well. Said, well, this is really solid, very, very solid stuff. The emphasis on science, the emphasis on peer-reviewed studies across various aspects. But they're basically saying, look, yeah, like if children go into this, then they get a multidisciplinary team. It's led by, they're saying there needs to be a doctor whose total responsibility is for child safety. Not trying to promote them changing gender. And we're in a situation in Ireland where there's books about all of this stuff that are not being allowed home with children for the parents to see it. Where trans activists are coming into schools to give lectures.
Yeah.
And where the Department of Education and everybody's afraid to take on the captivity of the trade unions and the captivity, I'm talking about the teacher unions, and the captivity of the Department of Health on this matter. Everybody is scared to take it on as if somehow it's a mortal sin. And here we have, sitting next door in our nearest neighbour, the actual science which says that it is damaging.
Yeah.
It is damaging to continue what we've been doing. There is no evidence to support even the hormonal treatment. They're getting into all of that. There's no evidence to support that you deal with dysphoria using those things, and there's no off ramp. There's no detransition program. Once it's done, people are forgotten about. They don't even appear in data.
People are abandoned. That's very correct,
yeah.
And their viewpoint and their regret is not acknowledged. But in Ireland in particular, we have an organisation called Belong To. Belong To is a very well funded organisation. If you look at their financials, they have over 800,000 in the bank account. They got a grant of 500,000 from Google, of all people, about maybe 4 years ago to set up what's called the quality mark for secondary schools, where schools undergo 18 months of what they describe as training in, now a lot of it's LGB stuff, but the T in that stands for transgender. So it is transgender based stuff. And what happens is they come in and they train into school, but they produced a report, and it was also issued last year as well, called the Trans Care Research Report 2024. And it's in direct opposition to the Cass report. Now, the Cass report is, as I said, gold standard, because you only have to look at the author and the other sub-authors within the Cass report.
And the methodology.
This transgender report 2024 was authored up by two people. One person is the advocacy manager at Belong To, who recently got a PhD, a Dr. Kennedy, and the other author is associate professor, I think, in gender studies at one or other universities in this country. So in other words, it is an academic report up to a point. But if an academic report has an advocacy manager as part of that report, I mean, and in fairness,
it's activism basically
declared, so there's nothing hidden here. There's nothing wrong about it. I want to emphasize that, but you cannot compare it with the gold standard Cass report. And this Belong To report, which is the Trans Care Report 2020, advocates what is described as gender affirmation and calling on the Department of Health to produce a gender affirmation type model. Now, that is in direct opposition to the Cass report, which describes gender affirmation as not a neutral act that leads on to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and irreversible surgery in many cases. So in other words, you have two reports here, one advocating gender affirmation, and that is the report that seems to be adopted by certainly the Department of Education in allowing Belong To into schools as third-party activists. And on the other hand, you have the gold standard Cass report that's saying, stop it, that's completely wrong, because social transitioning, meaning the use of pronouns, is not a neutral act.
Yeah, the fact that there is, I mean, I find it, to be honest, Vincent, I knew quite a bit about this, but actually when I got into the CAS report and I saw the type of topics they were covering and how there was different funnels of peer-reviewed studies done, it was extremely rigorous in its approach. So therefore, like you're comparing there the CAS report to what is effectively an NGO, being
Correct.
by a
Producing
small
an
number of
advocacy
activists.
report. Absolutely. I mean, you can't do that. I mean, they're entitled to produce an advocacy report. Of course they are. But I don't think, I mean, I will say quite plainly, the Department of Education is not entitled to accept that and to allow third-party advocates to enter into Irish schools and do what the CAS report would describe as create harm. And that's very wrong. And I mean, we've seen that in a certain school in the Midlands, Wilson's Hospital School, which I'm sure you'll be coming on to. I mean, and the Holding Up Burke issue over the use of pronouns. Yeah. According to the CAS report, if you use pronouns to a child that do not align with the child's birth sex, you're setting them on a program that will lead on to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones and irreversible surgery, and therefore it's viewed as harmful and therefore is viewed as not a neutral act, and it is counselled against within the CAS report. And as you say,
can I pause you there now, because we're at a critical point there. I mean, I think let's just go onto this. It's not a tangent onto this parallel major issue. So therefore, my reading of it, stop me again if I'm getting this wrong, my reading of it from the CAS report is that had Vincent's Hospital studied the CAS report and adopted it, you said earlier on, community centres can do this, schools can do it, clubs can do it.
Absolutely, yes.
Then there's no, then we wouldn't have had the Enoch Burke saga, because the position that he was taking is actually in tune with the CAS report.
Completely so. And he got it before the CAS report, in fairness. I mean, I don't know when his issue started. It was probably about a year before the CAS report was published. Although anybody in the know knew that the CAS report...
Well, there was an interim report in 2022. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, because of that, he was simply ahead of the curve. He got it right. Now, from the school's board of management point of view, or board of governors, I mean, if I were there, it's a very simple issue. The science has changed. You might have made a decision in good faith, although that's very, very debatable. But anyway, a decision was made. But now that decision must be reversed because the science has changed, and science changes all the time. There's no big deal about that. And I suppose boards of governors or groups of doctors or whoever must have the generosity, the common sense and the wisdom to be able to say, well, that was then and this is now. Science has moved on, so we move on with the science. Nothing should be fossilized. And I mean, Wilson's Hospital School had the perfect let off to be able to say, well, listen, we now realize there's a new report in, there's a new way of doing things. It's gold standard and we accept it. And therefore, we're not going to allow the use of pronouns that do not align with a child's birth sex. It's as simple as that. Everybody else is doing it, certainly in the UK and throughout the world.
Now, what I found shocking from the report is the complete dearth of evidence, because this is a scientific report. And they're basically saying, look, there's a dearth of evidence here. The evidence is weak. Like, that's the terminology. But I know what that means as a layperson. Like, there is no real evidence, especially long-term studies, to show the impact.
No, nothing like that at all. Nothing like that at all. And it all comes back to the adaptation of the W path that we were talking about earlier on, these world professional guidelines, which are a combination of lobbyists and some academics. And that was viewed as that version of gold standard, although it was never called gold standard. It was accepted generally by governments. And then there was things called the Dutch protocols as well that involved the use of puberty blockers, but none of it was evidence-based. None of it was based on long-term studies. None of it sort of, I suppose, quantified the damage and the regret that might happen. So there was no real science behind it, but there was a lot of money behind it, and there was
exactly. Can I pause you on the money point there for a second? So if I go through, if I go to the extreme version of this and I go through substantial surgical anatomical change, I'm going to be on medicine, hormonal treatment, I presume, for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge win for the pharmaceutical industry that are actually producing the stuff that goes into the bodies.
Absolutely. And that's been very controversial as well, because we all know a firm based in Ireland produces it, and that's called Abvil, and it's a pharmaceutical company, and we all know who's senior within the marketing management of that company, and his relationship with a government minister. Therefore, it's something that, is very money driven. I would imagine the whole area of puberty blockers, they're expensive. It's lifelong commitment. And I would just sort of worry about any conflicts of interest that might arise there.
But if you have a situation where the Department of Education, the trade unions, the teachers are noticeable by their quietness. I know because I speak to quite a few and I know they're very concerned about this, but they're just not prepared. Everybody's scared because they've mortgages to pay and they've income to bring in, they've families to look after. And they want to speak up, but they're afraid to speak up. And they now have the CAS report, but the CAS report is not received, from what I was looking around, very little coverage, if any, in the Irish mainstream media.
Correct. You won't really find it anywhere. And that's absolutely extraordinary because it has set the agenda, the political agenda, the medical agenda, the educational agenda, all the relevant agendas across the water in the UK and in Northern Ireland as well.
Hey guys, just a quick interlude here to let you know about my new workshops. They run around 2.5 hours plus, and I go through the core of any given issue. So I've done mental strength and resilience, all the best tools in psychology, and I've also done critical thinking. So I've run a few of those already, and the next versions are coming up on the 20th and 21st of February. So you can get in there to the website, ivorcumminsworkshops.com, and have a look, because I also have a weight loss one. My first session on weight loss mastery is, I think, the 16th of February coming. So anyway, just to let you know, I've had a lot of people in already, great sessions, very interactive, and it's been going great. So there you are. We'll go back to the interview.
I mean, and in Ireland, that hasn't happened. Now, as I said, the reason why it probably hasn't happened is the WPATH protocols were inserted into the programme of government in 2020. I haven't seen what this programme for government has, but I'm 100% certain that there'll be no reference to WPATH in it. So this now frees up all organisations to go and embrace the CAS report. There's no reason why they should not move along with the science. And that includes responsibility for schools, sports clubs and everybody else as well. But there is another very interesting angle that isn't flagged. I mean, if any organisation goes against best practice guidelines, best medical guidelines, and deliberately adopts guidelines that are not evidence-based, I mean, and if that causes damage to any child or anybody for that matter, surely to goodness that person puts themselves at risk of legal action. I mean, and I'm talking about individual teachers every bit as much as schools, boards and governors and patrons of schools as well, that may well be churches or whatever. I mean, if you deliberately disregard best practice medical guidelines and work off a model that is unproven, unscientific and not accepted by any of the academic bodies, you're placing yourself at great legal peril.
Yes, but I mean, it's inevitable. I mean, any senior barrister getting a hold of the CAS report and looking at the WPAT model that we're submerged in ideology in this country, will be licking his lips or her lips at the prospect of going into the High Court.
It's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time.
It's only a matter of time, yeah.
It couldn't be defended. I mean, the Long 2 report is an interesting report. It's one that I've read, I've looked at it and I've dismissed it. But I've read it. And I mean, I welcome anybody producing reports. It's a good thing to sort of throw into any mix, but it must be allowed to be criticised. And I have looked at it and I am criticising it and I am dismissing it. It's not in any way medically watertight and it offers bad advice. It's an advocacy report, but for that to be accepted and for, in effect, the CAS report not to be, I mean, that is absolute madness. It is not part of any sort of scientific, there can be no science behind that. The science is behind the CAS report and it must be embraced by the Department of Health, by our political sort of parties, by schools, sports clubs, everybody else.
Agreed, but it needs to start as well with editors and producers of radio stations saying this we need to get on the right side of this, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because they should have their media instinct should be honed now to a very substantial pivot going on globally. There's a gale coming across from the North America, and like the flags were all there. I mean, in April 20, halfway through the CAS report, Vincent, you may or may not be aware of this, but in April 2022, the UK Health Secretary Sajid Javid said of the CAS report, compared to what was in existence before it, he said it was too affirmative, too narrow, and bordering on ideological. Now, that's the Minister for Health in the UK commenting effectively on the Irish model. Let me say that again. It's too affirmative and narrow, bordering on ideological.
Yes. But I mean, that's been, completely replaced now by the CAS report. We're working off an outdated model. We're working off a dangerous model and a model that causes harm. Remember, the word harmful was used in the CAS report. Also, the phrase that social transitioning is not a neutral act. That was also phrased in the CAS report in that way as well. So you cannot, as you say, if a barrister were to look at that and compare it with any other report, either the WAPAT report, which was part of our programme for government, or else the transgender care report 2024 produced by Belong To. You cannot compare them. One is science and one is not. But what concerns me hugely is that third-party advocacy groups can enter into Irish schools without any risk assessment done, without any sense of understanding where they're coming from. I mean, Belong To have what they call stand-up week every week in September in many, many, many Irish secondary schools. They've offered what they describe as their quality mark, which follows 18 months of engagement with the school to almost 40 secondary schools. I think it's 39 schools at this stage. And these are schools that follow the Belong To model, and the Belong To model follows gender affirming care. So in other words, if a young person says, I think I'm born in the wrong body or whatever it is, a boy thinks they're a girl thinks they're a boy, the starting point is to accept that. The CAS report say the starting point is to challenge that. There's no in between. It's either or. And we're on the wrong side of science. And so are schools. And at this point, they know it. Nobody can plead ignorance at this stage.
Can I just pause on that very
medical advice?
Let me just pause on that very important point. So a child in a classroom basically presents as feeling confused about their gender. Girl thinks he wants. By the way, I noticed from the data that 75% of it is females.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
and only 25% males. I find that very. I don't know what the reason for that is, but that is a very interesting piece of data. But say it's a girl, right? She wants to be a boy. Feels she wants to be a boy. Then, on the existing model we're using, which was commented again, I refer to it. The British Minister for Health would have commented on the Irish model using those for that is too affirmative. It's narrow. It's bordering ideological. That all of the children in the classroom are now being pulled in to support the affirmation and to play along with the fantasy, or could be a fantasy. In most cases, it will be a temporary imbalance, a mental imbalance, which will sort itself out. And in some extreme cases, yes, there is genuine requirement for what I regard as extreme outcomes. But like they're tiny number. I mean, if you look at the data, Vincent. Again, I found this absolute because data is something that I watch from 2009 to 2020. I mean, there was a 27 times increase. 27 times increase in children presenting. And when they looked at that, they're saying, well, like what could be causing that? And they said, well, general acceptability about transgender, social media, abuse is in there. There's a number of contributory factors, they think.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's why the CAS report was commissioned, because people just didn't know and they were trying to find out. But another word in the CAS report, and it's something we're very bad at in this country, is the use of the word abundance of caution. The CAS report really is talking about getting children along to adulthood, where then they can make informed decisions. And that's not happening. If you socially transition a child by agreeing to their preferred pronouns, then you are socially transitioning them, then you are not displaying an abundance of caution. An abundance of caution, as defined by the CAS report, means bringing children along at least to the age of majority, where they are in a position to make decisions that are life-changing. And we don't do that in this country. According to the gender affirmation model, what we do is we accept that child is using the pronouns that they claim they now align with. And that's wrong.
Well, can I put this to you bluntly then and in plain English? That would mean, based on the CAS report, which is the science side of it, just based on the street language side of it, those that are encouraging children in the classroom to play along with the affirmation, to play along with the fantasy, are actually endangering. They're endangering not just the children that are playing along, because they themselves could fall into the same syndrome. They're also endangering the child. That's essential. The affirmation.
Yes.
Is that?
Yes, I would certainly think so. Because a child is not just an isolated person, they're part of a community, a school community, absolutely. And that is what's happening. And again, they're encouraging the children in that scenario you painted out there. They're encouraging the children again to go against the advice given in the CAS report. I mean, it all boils down to the CAS report, those 4 words. It underpins how we ought to relate to this entire issue. It offers this gold standard advice.
And is there yet any sign of any organisations, just to say in the medical area, just to stick with that, forget community and schools and all like that, that'll all pour out. But is there any sign of any medical organisation awake to the CAS report, discussed it, debated and said, we're going to adopt this?
Not as far as I'm aware. It's something that most people shy away from for obvious reasons. I mean, you don't want to be pursued by agendaists. You don't want to be cancelled wherever you go. And you don't want to be defamed in social media either. So most people simply avoid the topic, as you can imagine. And that's not healthy for democracy. That's not healthy for open debate or free speech. And that is very wrong. But regarding Irish medical professional organisations, as far as I'm aware, unlike in the UK, none of them have come out and have embraced the CAS report. Now, you have things at the Irish College of General Practice, the Irish Hospital Consultants Association. You have a range of bodies that are either academic or quasi-academic in one type or another. And they have not, to the best of my knowledge, none of them have embraced the CAS report. Now, you have other codes of medical practice as well that are much smaller and that are operate on a voluntary basis. Take, for example, the world of acupuncture, and to their enormous credit, the Acupuncture Council of Ireland has voted at an AGM a few months ago to unequivocally embrace the CAS report, and no other medical organisation, and that's a very small medical organisation, it's voluntary, it's not legislated for what they do. The Irish College of General Practice and other organisations are legislated for and are the big heavy hitters. None of them have embraced the CAS report. As far as I'm aware, the only organisation that's in deals offering therapies, if you like, to people would be the Acupuncture Council of Ireland, and they have embraced the CAS report by a free vote, a majority vote of its membership. I just wish there was the same with the Irish College of GPs or any other academic body, because that's what's needed. Yeah. It's happened in the United Kingdom.
It's why I mentioned our experience with the thalidomide scandal back in the early 60s, that it took us 4 years to come around, despite the fact that our neighbours next door had banned it 4 years before, and the Germans, literally within days of the Germans, we seem to be at the same moment again, which what I call manufactured ignorance, turn a blind eye. The term for it is agnogenesis, the Greek term for it. And we seem to be in a state again. Because
with the thalidomide, I mean, there was no real agenda. You could argue that there perhaps was laziness there or academic disinterest. But in this information age now, I mean, there's no excuse for ignorance. But the problem here is agenda. There are well-funded agendaists. As I said, Google donated 500,000 euros to an advocacy group called Belong To. Now, I have no difficulty with advocacy groups once they say what they're doing, and in fairness, Belong To do. But I believe what they're doing is harmful simply because they are going against the best advice given by the CAS report. But for Google to give without any, my understanding is, consultation with parents, without any consultation directly with schools, without any risk assessment done, without any investigation as to the concept of regret with people who undergo transitioning, I mean, with no basic things.
It's effectively actionable.
100,000 handed law.
And it's actionable. I mean, it's
I
clearly
hope
actually.
it is. I hope it is, because that's part of funding the damaging of children. Again, I'm using language that you'll find, and you found reading it up in the
In the
CAS
Castro.
report. I mean, it is okay. So that money was donated before the CAS report was published, but there's no sense of regret over giving that money. There's no sense of, and as recently as a couple of months ago, Dáil Deputy Jack Chambers was at a meeting with Belong To, in which the giving of the quality mark to schools was praised as something praiseworthy. I put it down as utterly dangerous and reckless to give a school the quality mark. Now, as I say, the quality mark is the LGBTQT mark, but once you have the T as part of it, it means that there is the transgender aspect to it. And we're only talking today about the transgender aspect of all of that. And we're only talking about how it affects children. And having ring-fenced it at that, I mean, it is utterly dangerous to bring ideology like that into schools, according to the CAS report. So for a Dáil deputy to be part, on the government benches, to be part of the promotion of Belong To and the quality report and the quality mark is absolutely wrong. I mean, what I'm calling now for Belong To as an advocacy organisation to do is very simple. Embrace the CAS report. I will disagree with what other you might be doing, but can we not agree to embrace the CAS report and to advise against gender affirming care for minors?
Yeah, I think that pretty much summarizes, the position that a lot of activists, because I noticed that they were split on their reaction to the CAS report, because it's clear science versus ideology. So they have to shift some of them. Some of the more entrenched ones haven't yet, and some are maintaining a neutral stance, which means they don't know how the hell to deal with it. But what's interesting about the CAS report, Vincent, is that they actually dealt squarely, as part of their study, into the amount of pressure clinicians and doctors found themselves under to adopt this affirmation model without questioning, and basically trample on informed consent, which resonates back to what happened during COVID, when informed consent was trampled on again with a kind of a centralized approach to what is a very complex area, because that's what Cass is saying. It needs a multidisciplinary team. It needs a completely different approach. It needs
Dr.
science.
Cass herself referred to that. Dr. Cass mentioned the pressure that she was under. I mean, look, she's a scientist. She's a medical doctor. She should not be under pressure. Her work should be appreciated and embraced, and equally critiqued.
That's the point, that in the real world, that's the issue. I mean, for me, just looking at it from the outside, knowing how Ireland operates, everybody knows what needs to be done. This is the agnogenesis point, the kind of, but nobody wants to do it. I mean, back in the day, by the way, back in the early 60s, the Irish government knew exactly what to do, but they didn't want to do it because it would threaten Irish exceptionalism, and it was a decision. And if you go back to the way the religious orders dealt with children that were born outside of marriage and so on from 1920, there was a report in the 1920s that was buried, which clearly stated what was going on in these institutions. It was buried because, again, it threatened Irish exceptionalism. And we're back to the same point. And for me, anyway, this is my opinion. We seem to be back to the same point again. How the hell are we going to get the medical establishment and the educational establishment to accept the CAS report when we seem to have a cultural vulnerability to keep ourselves in a state of manufactured ignorance? That's the real question.
I would say two things. First, we're in a completely different age. We're in the information age, so you can't just bury stuff. I mean, you and I, all of us, are having conversation about this, and we need to keep that conversation open. And that probably is the main thing there, that you cannot bury it. And also, I mean, there's an international dimension to this.
Yes.
It's not just within Ireland. You cannot ignore what the rest of the world is doing. So, I mean, the landscape is utterly and completely changing. But the difficulty is, and everybody's entitled to their point of view, and I mean, people are entitled to try to put a scientific angle on their point of view if they can, once it's critiqued and once it's held up to fair criticism. And that's all we're doing. We're offering fair criticism of WPATH. We're offering fair criticism of the 2024 Belong To transgender report. There's no problem there. These are reports that were produced, but they now now have fallen behind in the science. And we're simply saying in this modern information age, there is no excuse for ignorance. There's no excuse for this exceptionalism. There's no excuse for not doing what is the right thing, especially when the health, welfare and well-being of children are at stake. So we need to fully and completely embrace the Cass report. But we are able to do it now because the new programme of government, I presume, makes no reference to the WPATH the way the old programme of government did. There was a three-party coalition in the last government.
Greens, yeah.
The Green Party had that particular item inserted into the programme of government. And I presume, I don't know how these things operate, I presume when something goes into a programme of government, it's beyond debate then for the next 4 years or whatever. It's not. It is accepted. And that's why there was no debate. Now, that was then, this is now. This is a time for debate, and this is the time to completely embrace the best science, the best medical science that is available as pervade through the Cass report.
So just to swing back to some point that you made in the middle of all of that, Vincent, just maybe as we kind of conclude, really what I'm picking up here is that leaders of social clubs, kids clubs, sports clubs, communities, schools, anywhere where children are, whoever is leading in that area, boards, whether they're boards or whether they're small groups of people, they need to look at the Cass report and they need to consider what their policy change is going to be to deal with the science which has now arrived since April last year. And
that is absolutely essential.
And not wait for Irish politics to catch up with them.
Sure. I mean, it's their responsibility. They can't say the government didn't tell us. I mean, it is out there now. It is their responsibility because they do it all the time. I mean, many sports clubs have issues where they may say, well, what do we do if a boy playing football claims he wants to play girls football now or something along those lines? I mean, most sports clubs and codes of sports have written protocols around this. Schools, I don't know if they have. I mean, schools should have. I mean, take, for example, the case in Wilson's Hospital School, which is, I suppose, the battleground, if you like, in this country. I mean, this is a school that has certainly probably the best known school in Ireland, and it's internationally one of the best known schools for, I would say, all the wrong reasons. I mean, there you have a Herculean battle between a board of governors and a school that appears to be supported by the Department of Education and in fact supported by government and supported by a church and supported by sort of many other sort of, I suppose, the media. And on the other hand, you have a person who's saying, no, we will follow what we now describe as the Cass report. Although when Mr. Burke started his objection, it was pre the Cass report. But nonetheless, as I said, he got it right, they got it wrong. But it's a typical example of a child in a school or a child in a sports club or a child anywhere else in a youth group making a statement saying, I now want to be called by my new pronouns. What does the leader or the superintendent or the board of governor or the teacher of that club or whatever it is, school, say? How do they adjust it? What do they say? And what you must do now is you must abide by the best practice guidelines in the Cass report. You cannot indulge that fantasy. You cannot, by doing that, and you would do so in a respectful and in a kind way, involving parents and involving everybody. Even if the guardians or parents say, no, I want my boy now to be called a girl, it behoves the person in charge of that club or school or whatever to be able to say, no, that the best practice guidelines say to do so causes harm, and therefore we're not prepared to do so, even following upon your request. And that may have to go to board level, as it would with a board of governors within a school, and that's absolutely fine. But all any school has to do now is say, the science has changed, we have a new document, we are writing new policies, we are rewriting our old policies, this is what we're doing. And present that to the Department of Education, if you like, because they can hardly say no at this point. I wonder what they will say now that there's a new government in, and I hope a new minister in. I haven't followed up on that yet, because the actual sort of absolute, I cannot understand Minister Foley and her dogged persistence of bringing in transgender stuff into young minds and into children and into school, and broaching the subject in school in a manner that undermines parenting. And that's something that I'm absolutely shocked about. It totally undermines parenting, and the parents are the primary educators according to our constitution. But one way or the other, the science has moved on. We're in a new era now. The Cass report must be embraced by everybody at this stage, because you cannot chip away at it. It is beyond reproach based on the rigorous nature of the science that underpins it.
Well, I would say, Vincent, that taking more of a helicopter view, the same government tried to convince the Irish people to adopt the constitutional change in March last year to change the definition of family. It's the same government that are pushing this ideology through, and both of those things, I believe, are an assault on the basic unit of Irish society, the family itself. And I think they're all connected. I also think that the resistance to getting rid of this bloody awful hate speech stuff from the Irish legislation is also driven from the same source. It's coming from the same spring, and it's all part of a wider agenda, whether knowingly or unknowingly playing out in front of us. But it's going to be very interesting because the US government are getting rid of it out of the schools, and that's really creating a massive international agenda. I would suggest, as we wrap, Vincent, that anybody who's listened to this discussion and listening to you carefully can see clearly in you the rigorous adoption of the scientific method, the openness to invite people in to debate, and to let the science decide the course and the truth to be revealed. So I would say to people watching this, look, take this recording, link it, and send it with a copy of the Cass report to anybody you know that's on the board of a school, especially the Wilson Hospital School. They need to be first to get it, so that if there's no hiding place, then community leaders, clubs, as well as local politicians, they'll be last, of course, to accept it. They'll follow when they feel the public are moving in a different direction. They lead from behind. I accept that. But that's the way to do this. We need people to take action, even as limited as that, because it will help. And you know that you have science behind you.
Totally agree with that. But also, I would say that any school should be very, very, very careful about letting any third-party advocacy group enter into the school without a risk assessment done. I mean, people can just go up to the school and produce an ideology from any sort of ideology, if the headmaster, whoever seems to agree, and a person can address a class. I mean, all that carries risk. That's not what schools are for. Schools are for education, and schools the interaction with children should be from professionally trained people, not people who just come in as third-party advocates for whatever they might advocate for, but particularly to advocate in terms of transgenderism or anything like that. I mean, that should not be allowed across the threshold of any school, because parents are not there. Parents presumably have been consulted in a meaningful way, and it creates a mindset within the school, or it has the potential to create a mindset within children that will boost up that 27-fold increase that you mentioned in transgender interest amongst.
Well, I think we're close to the point where just an insurance point that may not have crossed your mind, and that's that those clubs and associations and all the rest of them that are out there have public liability insurance cover. And that only stands up provided you've done best efforts to get your house in order. If you rigorously ignore science that has been presented, which is saying that you're doing something here that is potentially damaging to children, you can't rely on your insurance policy to pay out. And I'd imagine we're close to a point where there'll be exemptions coming in on these insurance policies shortly to say if you're not adapting the Cass report, you're not covered in this area of gender dysphoria.
I should hope so. I mean, that makes common sense. That'd be a good start. And again, the science would be behind the insurance company. Absolutely. Totally agree on that one. I mean, let's just, we shouldn't really be having this conversation, and we wouldn't be under normal circumstances. And these are not normal circumstances because of the agendas that are there. I mean, in normal medicine, you don't have agendas. You just get on and you do what you hope is best based on whatever the evidence and science is. And I would say to the whole area of transgenderism, just carry on as you would with any other scientific endeavor. Now we have a scientific report. Let's use it, let's embrace it, and let's get on with our jobs.
Well, Vincent, thanks so much for that, for giving me that interview. I think this is a very, very important discussion. I think it will have legs because it's reaching out to the people in the middle that just don't know this stuff in the detail they need it, and giving them a pathway through to getting the information to those that need to, that are in positions of vulnerability, I mean legal vulnerability, as well as in positions of authority that need to stand up and take notice of this. Because if you're waiting around for the Irish government to tell you what to do, and that's the last thing, that'll be the last step on the path. You need to take the first step yourself and think about your own position.
Thank you very much, Eddie. I completely agree with you.
Thanks, Vincent, and we'll wrap it at that. And let's come back to this again, maybe later in the year, and see what's actually after happening, because we're only 24 hours after the momentous change and the executive orders coming across from the North Atlantic, from the United States, where they've clearly said there's only two genders in the schools now, and that's male and female, and that's pretty emphatic. And also the American administration are leaving the World Health Organization, which is the end of the World Health Organization, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's something that's positive.
Not a moment too soon.
Thank you very much, Eddie.
Thank you very much, Vincent.
Well, I hope you found that very informative, and I hope the Irish and many other authorities around the world are going to sit up, take notice, and realise that the game is up. So these biased ideologues in the NGOs who have taken over our governments, basically, and our education system, their day is done, I believe. So let this be known, share, and get it to your politicians, and let them know that we see them.